Sometimes there are videos that you really look forward to making, videos that you have a great idea exactly what you're going to say, and you can't wait to get it onto paper and subsequently onto the internet. Then there are videos like these. Videos that you've been kind of dreading making, but still realize that something has to be said, something has to be remarked on, and it just wouldn't be fitting for your channel to let some historical event that is of relatively large significance go by unremarked on. And so, with this in mind, I'm forced to start my video about Game of Thrones. Now, let's get one thing right out of the way. The last season of Game of Thrones was bad. It was really bad. And I've already made a video discussing how Game of Thrones jumped the shark. I was expecting this, but I wasn't expecting an ending that would be quite so incompetently made. When the final season of Game of Thrones was starting up again, I really didn't want to watch it because I knew what was coming. It was clear from the previous season that the creators were totally out of ideas and had no idea how to create a satisfying ending for the show. But as with most of these things, my wife and family wanted me to watch Game of Thrones with them. After all, I was the person who had gotten them into the series to begin with, much to my chagrin, and to them I think it just didn't seem like good sport that I should be able to duck out for the final catastrophe that we all knew was coming. And so, like the protagonist in A Clockwork Orange, I was sitting there unwillingly watching the desecration of something that I had formerly quite enjoyed, that I formerly had believed might contain some meaning, some truth, some beauty. And going into this season, I was really expecting things to go bad. I knew that the final fight against the undead would be some CGI slapfest. I knew there would be some kind of contrived political ending that would place a preferred character on the Iron Throne, and assure the audience that sure enough, Westeros was one step closer to our own world of progressive, liberal, and modern values. But in all of this, I'd always anticipated that the creators of the show, the showrunners, would do a good enough job to competently land the series, to satisfy the fans who were never really in it for the large idea or the feelings of edification, who weren't like me expecting Game of Thrones to end like King Lear or something. I mean, we've already gone through Harry Potter, we've already gone through Lord of the Rings. Everyone in Hollywood knows how to shoot an epic fantasy ending with all of the characters blowing each other up and good finally coming to triumph over evil. I'm sure there are many in Hollywood that feel like they could teach a class on how to do this. It's not a particularly hard thing to write. But just into the second episode of the last season of Game of Thrones, I sort of realized in a moment of sadistic delight that the showrunners were so incompetent that they couldn't even pull off a paint-by-numbers fantasy ending. I realized that both of the showrunners were in such a disarray, in such confusion about what they wanted to achieve, that they really couldn't commit to any one ending of Game of Thrones. They couldn't commit to a popcorn fantasy set-piece ending that would be very satisfying for the fans. They were totally unable to deliver some kind of cathartic tragic ending, although I pretty much had given up hope for that in the 7th season. And finally, and most surprisingly of all, the showrunners couldn't even successfully pander to their own progressive audience. They couldn't keep a consistent enough narrative vision to give progressives the kind of self-validating story about the strong women overcoming the evil white men that would have the usual crowd who showed up to defend The Last Jedi probably defend the last season of Game of Thrones, regardless of its other narrative flaws. But even this cheap shot, even this get-out-of-jail-free card, even this tried-and-true method of playing to progressive pieties in order to get a reliable contingent of defenders to back you up when the critical reviews finally come in, even this was something that seemed to be totally out of reach for the people who developed the last season of Game of Thrones. But instead, what did we get? We got Game of Thrones Mad Libs. We got Game of Thrones March Madness, where you could pretty much randomly decide who you thought would be on the Iron Throne, and work out the plot retroactively to justify that random decision. Who's going to kill the Night King? Well, it's probably going to have to either be Daenerys, Jon, or Bran Stark, but since we're playing Game of Thrones Mad Libs and we pulled out Arya, I guess it's going to have to be Arya Stark, even though she has no emotional relationship to the character of the Night King, and nothing's been building towards that end at all. Who's going to rule the Seven Kingdoms? Who's going to sit on the Iron Throne, even though we all know it's going to be destroyed? Well, that's going to be Bran Stark, coming out of nowhere, not even defeating the one one villain we had been built up to believe he would confront over 4 or 5 seasons. We know we need to kill Daenerys Targaryen off because presumably George R. R. Martin put that prominently in the notes he had planned for the next 2 books. We also need Daenerys to be a hero in the battle against the Night King, so what do? Well, let's just have the character radically flip-flop in personalities, being Captain Marvel in one episode and then Medea the Mad Queen in the next. I mean, even the actors on screen look like they're confused with the whole process, as if they're just waiting around to do their preordained actions that will close out their stories, and have no real idea about how this impacts their characters emotionally, because really, nothing that occurs in the final season is built up to or foreshadowed at all. We've been handed a final state of the Game of Thrones Westeros universe by either George R. R. Martin or by what I think just by playing a random game of Mad Libs, and we're going to create that by operating on contrived plot point after contrived plot point. A string of shocking occurrences that violate any mode of good storytelling and ultimately result in nothing. And initially I kind of dreaded watching the last season of Game of Thrones more or less because I didn't really like the idea of me hating how the ending turned out and having all of my friends who were more just focused on the spectacle and plot enjoy it, and complain again about me overanalyzing things and wanting Shakespeare when I was just watching a stupid fantasy movie. But at the end of the last season of Game of Thrones, I actually was kind of enjoying myself because there was no way that anybody could think that the final season of Game of Thrones was good or satisfying or in any ways well crafted. It felt like the showrunners were just trying to pull the whole thing down, and I swear in the last episode you can watch people undoing the scaffolding from behind the scenes as the actors are reciting their lines. Everyone is looking forward to their next paycheck, their next role. They have no care in the world for how these characters actually end up or where the story has actually left the audience. Now, I know that this is more or less a follow-up to an earlier video I did on Game of Thrones about 1.5 years ago, and there I speculated that Game of Thrones wasn't going to have a good ending and really couldn't have a good ending because both the showrunners and George R. R. Martin himself didn't really have a good basis for creating a catharsis. They didn't really have an understanding about how they were going to pull off high tragedy, and so simultaneously, the endings that would take the show's own original darkness seriously were cut off from them. They couldn't make this Antigone, they couldn't make this King Lear, and at the same time they also couldn't make this Lord of the Rings. But this season, the problems are much more pedestrian than that. We're not talking about mindless style that has no understanding of transcendental substance. We're talking about a creative team that in this final season had no desire to follow rudimentary rules of good filmmaking and good storytelling. Nobody cared, and it was beautiful. I have to confess to having a sort of photo-negative, totally inverted reaction to the last season of Game of Thrones than pretty much any one of my other friends who watched this show regularly. Everyone was so upset about how cheaply their own favorite character had been treated. Jon Snow didn't have some kind of epic moment of heroism. He didn't have some moment of confrontation with the Night King. He didn't have a moment where he took power in the Seven Kingdoms or brought peace to a people. The best he could manage was really a sort of half-hearted assassination of Daenerys Targaryen, and a tragedy that was really only born out of a relationship that had zero chemistry and that was hardly believable to begin with. In the end, he goes back to the Night's Watch, and you wonder, well, what is even the point? The story of Jon Snow is a story of a Night's Watch commander who had a lot of weird things happen to him one time. And it was more or less the same with all of the other characters. Tyrion didn't demonstrate his usefulness to the kingdom in any given way, at least during the show's running time, that is. You could imagine him being just as hated by the denizens of the Seven Kingdoms during his new reign as Hand of the King as he was during his first reign as Hand of the King. At least during his first reign as Hand of the King, he had accomplished something, which is something we never get to see in the last season. Again, all the Tyrion fans are wondering, what the heck is the point? And of course, every other character is dealt with just as flippantly. Sansa is made queen of an independent North, even though it was never very clear that she wanted to have direct political power, at least from the beginning of the show. It's also not clear why, at this point, getting out of the Seven Kingdoms is way easier than getting out of the European Union. Apparently, all you need to do to get out of the Seven Kingdoms is to say, I'm out, we want independence, and no one's going to lift a finger to stop you. I don't know, maybe Theresa May should take a page out of Sansa Stark's playbook. And of course, subsequently her sister, Arya, breaks from her permanent scowl to sail a ship west and discover the United States of America. While all the more minor characters take up roles on the small council that seem totally unsuited for their personalities. No one in any medieval context would really look up to a king that was bound in a wheelchair and that had fought no battles. And why is a ruthless cutthroat who doesn't even understand the meaning of lending and buying things in charge of the treasury? I guess going massively into debt is really not that big of a problem, at least as long as we like the guy who brings us there, right? These conclusions were so idiotic and so insulting to the intelligence of the audience that I don't think anybody bought them. They didn't make sense in the context of the original character, and they didn't build towards a larger cathartic point that would finish out the entire story. And personally, I thought this was quite delightful, because the characters as they existed in the 8th season weren't even really the characters that were so well drawn in the first 4. Sansa Stark was supposed to be a wide-eyed, idealistic young woman who yearned for romance and heroism. She wasn't a cold, emotionless figurehead whose only goal was to get independence for the North. Arya Stark was a well-meaning, eager, but naive young girl who aspired to be an adventurer, but who hadn't quite learned the lessons of the harshness of life that would naturally come with any sort of adventure or heroism that she sought. The Arya of the last season was a scowling assassin who seemed to look down on every other character who she was the obvious superior of, and whose every problem could be solved, of course, with a knife placed in the right position on the body of her enemies. Is there a cost to revenge? Well, most scholars would say yes. Didn't seem like Arya Stark ever learned that, but of course, we're not really into learning lessons in the 8th season of Game of Thrones, come now. And not to leave out everyone's favorite, Tyrion, a drunk and lecherous but somehow clever and competent dwarf, became just a drunk and lecherous dwarf who somehow was gifted to be Hand of the King, even though it seemed like everyone hated him and he hadn't made a smart decision in at least 2 seasons. And even the one character that I hated from the bunch, the absolutely perfect Captain Marvel that seemed to go from season 3 to season 5 looking like she was the liberator of all mankind, was turned into Maleficent, the mad Queen Medea who murdered her children and murdered everyone just to get power. Of course, this is totally not in keeping with the character they drew, but nevertheless, the concept of the character that people loved was totally betrayed. All of these characters were ruined, and to me there was something a little bit comforting about that, because the only thing worse than having the characters ruined was having them live on in people's imaginations. To have the character of Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow mean as much to our own culture as Luke Skywalker and Frodo Baggins do. It's one thing to have a character that everyone dislikes and thinks was ruined. It's another thing to have a mediocre and ultimately meaningless piece of culture take up more and more space in our own collective imaginations. Rest assured, at the end of the final season of Game of Thrones, pretty much every fan of the series was ready to pack up and really forget that they were ever fans of the entire endeavor to begin with. There was really nothing that anyone could latch onto as being meaningful or cathartic. I just feel sorry for the people who got tattoos of Khaleesi and named their children Daenerys. And when we think about this entire process, it's kind of odd, isn't it? I mean, Game of Thrones was probably the most significant piece of culture over the last decade. It basically defined the entire decade of 2010 to 2020. Is there another piece of culture that was more significant? Is there another piece of culture that was more talked about? And as consoling as it is for me to feel that a very disappointing ending is more or less going to ensure that we will never really look back on Game of Thrones with any particular emotion, I can't feel that there's something that's been deeply lost by the hole that Game of Thrones left, the place it occupied in our culture while really delivering nothing. I don't think the failure of something as big as Game of Thrones can have zero cultural impact. And while really, aside from the people who are making fun of the last season, no one is still talking about Game of Thrones Season 8, I do think that the long-term impact of Game of Thrones is going to be one largely characterized by disappointment, of disillusionment with what was promised. Ultimately, I do think Game of Thrones will be remembered in a certain sense, in the same way that I think The Last Jedi will be remembered as one of the most impactful Star Wars movies. These cultural products will be remembered not for what they were, but for what they brought to a close, for what they ended. And just as I think The Last Jedi has ended in many ways our infatuation with Star Wars, and from a corporate point of view, the period where Star Wars films would instantly be blockbusters, I think that this conclusion of Game of Thrones is going to mark the beginning of the end of what we have termed the golden age of television. This, of course, is the period that really started with The Sopranos in around 2000 and marked an increasing focus on shows that had continuous plots, in-depth characters, and of course storylines that carried on season to season to season, and with it very, very dedicated fan bases. Yet as dedicated as the fans are or were to any of these shows, and as much as any given fan will probably talk your ear off about how great the show he's currently binging on is, the dirty secret when it comes to most of these shows from the golden age of television is that very few of them have good endings, and are subsequently remembered after they go off of the air. There are some exceptions. Obviously, The Sopranos and Breaking Bad both seem to be fondly remembered, and I can vouch that Breaking Bad had a more or less satisfactory ending that set out the original vision of the series in stark relief, and I've heard that The Wire came together in a similarly satisfactory and meaningful way. But for the mainstay of these television shows, as addictive and enthralling as they are to watch at the time, they really don't amount to anything when you step back and everything is said and done. The first golden age of television show I remember really getting into was Battlestar Galactica, which was very, very enthralling when I was watching it. It even had some episodes that seemed like they had a lot of meaning and substance to them. And of course, as in all of these shows, the entire theme, the entire plot that was expressed over 1, 2, 3, 4 seasons seemed to be building up to some ultimate moment of catharsis and meaning, where the entire vision and message of the show would be laid out for people who stayed around and followed all of the clues. Of course, as one got to the later episodes and the later seasons of Battlestar Galactica, people realized that this really wasn't the case. There was no larger message that was being built to. There was no larger message or meaning that the showrunner had for what Battlestar Galactica ultimately meant. And each of the cliffhangers and mysteries that were constant from episode to episode were really just MacGuffins that people were using to lead the audience on. They were the classic J.J. Abrams mystery box. The creator didn't really have anything to show you, but he just wanted to keep you guessing what he had in the box. The show, it would turn out, was pure spectacle. There was nothing really to learn. And it was like this for show after show. House of Cards, Dexter, Lost. I mean, what was the point of all of it? I know in many ways the golden age of television was in some sense a response to the cynical 90s sitcom. In particular, I'm thinking of Seinfeld. What was Seinfeld? It was the show about nothing. No one learns anything, no one grows. We just have a cynical laugh and move on. And following that cynicism, following, I think, also 9/11, although very few people talk about that event anymore, I think people were hungry for television and entertainment that promised something more, that seemed to carry implicitly inside of them the understanding that something would be gained, something would be understood by watching the show to the end, by paying attention to the subtlety, the mysteries, the emotions and meaning that seem to be implicitly inside each of the scenes and characters. But I think what we're learning now is just because you can promise this meaning doesn't mean that you're going to deliver it. And this has always been the hurdle that seems to have killed most golden age of television shows. They never seem to be able to deliver on the promises they want to make to their audience, and everyone always walks away more disappointed, more jaded than they were when they started. And I think Game of Thrones, just by virtue of its size and also the magnitude of the failure that was the final season of Game of Thrones, might break this cycle. It might get people thinking in a different direction. It might get people to ask for more, to want more from their entertainment. I mean, people oftentimes treat fiction as if it's just a silly toy, but it's not. It's never really been a toy for humans. Fiction has always defined how we understand our lives. Narratives and stories, even stories that we know to be entirely mythological, definitely underlie how we conceptualize ourselves and what we think as right or wrong or meaningful or beautiful. That's why I think the continuous failure of the golden age of television to produce this on a large scale is something that can't be just waved away. We can't move from ultimate disappointment to ultimate disappointment, having each decade defined by media that is little more than spectacle. That's just depressing. If there's one thing that Game of Thrones has changed about my life, it's a certain skepticism about getting involved in watching these long TV shows to begin with. I mean, I don't want to start another epic series of television shows. I have better things to do with my time. I could watch a movie or read a book, although, given the quality of both newer books and newer movies, it's most likely to be an older one. And if Game of Thrones can convince people to make this transition, I have to say, I might actually look fondly on the last season of Game of Thrones, as much of a disaster area as it ultimately turned out to be. It may have made more of an impact on how we consume media than if the finale had been mediocre or passable. Maybe we're better having moved away from the golden era of television. To go back to consuming television is a stupid thing that people do to kill time. Better that than to be constantly waiting for a cathartic, meaningful TV show that rarely ever arrives. Yeah, I think that if this golden era of television comes to a close, there is going to be one thing that I mourn about its passing, and that is the decline of a common narrative and a common set of things that we all watch and all experience together. In the 90s, I remember always being able to talk about movies because movies were a big thing. They were sort of a touchstone that everyone talked about and really got invested in. And in many ways, in the 2000s and 2010s, this became television shows. I may have political disagreements with my progressive friends, but we could talk about Game of Thrones. Now it seems there's really only small talk. I mean, we're certainly not going to talk about politics, and that I think can be dangerous in a lot of ways. If there's one thing we might be able to glean from the mess that was Game of Thrones, it is that when we lose common narratives, we lose commonality of purpose and commonality of the ability to communicate in meaningful ways politically or socially. Power lies where men think it lies, and if that is all pointing in different directions, it's a formula for chaos. When these last big television shows that everyone seems to be watching finally fade from the scene, what will remain? What will be the large fictional narrative that keeps us all on the same page, that keeps us following the travails of one set of characters or the other? We may not have one. We may all go back to our common communities of interest and really forget any previous unity we once had in large pieces of media that we all were connected to. As a reactionary, sympathetic individual, part of me sees this as necessary, and another part of me sees this as preferable. Still, I know this is going to cause problems, and I know this is going to mean a breakdown of communication among people that really should be communicating more. I know many people who have talked about bridging the gap between left and right have always said you need to find some common topic you both can talk about in terms of something you love. If you and a progressive both love Star Wars, talk about that. If you and a progressive both love classical music, talk about that. And once you talk about that common thing that you love, you'll have an ability to understand them as an individual who's fighting for something he truly values, and not just as a naysayer, as a charlatan who's saying something to trip you up on your quest to achieve some value. And I think that's excellent advice, but it may not be salient if we are all broken up into our own little communities, each with our own stories, each with our own pieces of media that we value and follow independently of all the other ones. I would like to speculate that some piece of culture or media could come around that might unify us. And here, it might be my own vanity, but I do think that there is a role to be played by some future reactionary or dissident right cultural movement, because I don't think anything really true or meaningful can come out of progressive or post-liberal culture. Much of this I've talked about in my first video on Game of Thrones. But I feel more than anything else that we are in some kind of game with our modern producers and writers of culture. They scoff at the older concepts of objective value and meaning in the universe, and yet they try to promise that they have some secret higher meaning tucked right under their sleeves, placed inside the mystery box that they're always just about to show us. I think it's no coincidence that the only truly satisfying golden age of television show I can remember, Breaking Bad, more or less was just a proponent of the standard Christian Old Testament morality. It was a morality tale, but for the most part this is the exception, and modern creators of culture have no ability to give us something that definitive. They can't give us a moral framework or a story about right and wrong that we can believe in, and so it's a constant game of guess what's in the mystery box. We assure you it's meaningful, good, and beautiful. And so it's disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. The game keeps on going on. We have a progressive side of the aisle that really wants to see media always and everywhere just revalidate both their individual identities and also their progressive politics. We have a non-progressive media that more or less just wants to generate big spectacle, big budget explosions that it can export to China with really little or no interfering message that might interfere with the party line. In that space, in the future world that we are walking into culturally, the only people who can talk about real meaning, the only people who can talk about real beauty and real goodness are the old-fashioned reactionaries that still believe in it. There's an opportunity here for cultural creators who want to carry that torch onward, that want to do something that is not merely spectacle or self-congratulatory political masturbation. I think in many ways those artists will have no other recourse than to move to the right, than to move to spaces that are outside of progressive control. It may have to start with discussing darker truths about humanity, darker truths about the state of society as it exists in the present day. But I think there are many stories like this that need to be told, in fictional and in non-fictional form. Maybe it's vanity to think that the people that will ultimately produce this new message will emerge from the right or people who are affiliated with the right. But on examination, I think it's less vanity than just me not being able to see any type of alternative. The other ideological forces of our world just seem too bankrupt. They seem too focused on the game of self-congratulation or the game of spectacle and mystery box to ever really think about things that are larger and more spiritual. But as I think we've all learned, if from nowhere else than from this last season of television, the game has to end somewhere.